We are continuing learning together the words of Rabbi Steif, explaining to us the mission, the role, the duties, the merits, and the special responsibility of every single human being created in God Almighty's image, how each one of us is meant to increase the connection that we have with God Almighty. Now, everything that's created is completely one with God Almighty because there is nothing besides God Almighty. But we need to be aware of it, and we need to be not only aware of it, but we need to bring that awareness to other people. Meaning to say, once we become clear about what reality is, and we realize that there's nothing besides God Almighty, there is a God. That's the first commandment, belief in God. The second is to know that there is nothing besides God. That's the unity of God. Then you'll automatically know that since you are an expression of God Almighty, it's His loving kindness that is bringing you into existence at every single moment, that will cause you automatically to have a reciprocal love for the one who loves you so much. And then you're going to be so excited, you're going to want to tell everyone else. That's the mitzvah of Mitzvos Hashem, the love of God Almighty. The love of God Almighty means to say that you recognize what your source is, you recognize the love that you are receiving at every single instant, and then you are so excited and so enamored of this incredible God Almighty that's creating you, and you're so excited to be alive that you are now going to tell everyone else how great God is and how they are loved also by God Almighty. So that love of God Almighty leads to love of your fellow, wanting the best for them, wanting them to know the incredible reality, to be aware and to be focused, this should be the focus of our thinking 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 354 days a year. Why do I say 354 days a year? Because that's how many days there are in a 12-month lunar calendar. And there's 365 in the solar year. But every day we're meant to be completely, this should be everything we see is all we see is that there's nothing besides God Almighty. And we see everything that we're seeing is an expression of God Almighty. And even if it looks to us unpleasant, our job is to see through that, through the concealment, and realize the concealment isn't any concealment at all. As we learned last night, when we learned Tanya together in the 6th chapter of the Gate of Unity and training ourselves to maintain and preserve our divinely gifted internal tranquility, which is called Emunah, then this training is called Emunah. Then that we learn that this concealment, whatever concealment we think there is not really a concealment, because something can't conceal in itself. God can't conceal in Himself. So therefore, we could see right through the entire concealment and see that there's nothing besides God Almighty. What we're learning right now, we learned last week the absolute essential realization that we each have a purpose in this world. We each have an essential purpose in this world. We can't get blurry in our own minds what that purpose in the world is. And we learn that intermarriage is a calamity. So Lubavitch said it's a calamity. Why is it a calamity? Because a person who is supposed to be focused on his role and mission in the world lost sight of that, because there's a role and mission of the world of every single human being is to civilize the world, to bring the world to a place of the revelation of the divine purpose, which is that God Almighty wants the world to be filled with amazing human beings, serving God Almighty, helping each other, loving each other, and bringing goodness into the world. And it should be civilized, and all the commandments that we're learning must be observed by every single human being. The job of the Jew, who's a tiny fractional minority of the world population, is to bring holiness into that foundation, into that vessel created by the non-Jew. His job is to bring holiness into the world. So there comes now a heightened awareness of the presence of God Almighty and the concealment of God Almighty. Meaning to say, there are certain commandments that apply to a Jew, and a Jew has responsibilities for those. For example, the whole concept of purity, spiritual purity, of not becoming impure, ritually and spiritually impure from contact with a person who's deceased is something that is a special commandment, special responsibility of the Jewish people, and all the commandments related to that. Why is that? Why is that a special? What's the responsibility there? Because when a person is going to be spiritually attuned, and he's going to recognize that in the process of death, even though we recognize that there's nothing besides God Almighty, and the person everything is connected to God Almighty all the time, but when there is a cessation of the connection between the soul of the person and his body, that causes that is a concealment, a greater concealment of godliness, and therefore we want to recognize that is something that we want to avoid coming into contact with, and we want to avoid that infiltrating into our thinking and into our perception of reality. So therefore, a Jewish person is commanded to not become ritually impure, and if he's going to become, God forbid, impure from contact with the deceased, then he is prevented from going into the holy temple because of this heightened spiritual awareness. Now he's going to come into the presence of the of the holy temple in the holy city, in the holy land, and he can't go in there if he's spiritually impure. So this is a special responsibility of the people, the tiny fraction of the world population that's charged with the responsibility to be stewards of this holiness for the world, and that's represented by the holy temple, by the holy city, by the holy land, on behalf of all of humanity. And we see that there's these commandments that when we're learning here, the 7 commandments, which are really 30 commandments, and all the details that come with that, and all the laws related to proper conduct of a human being, we're covering a huge chunk of the Torah. But the rest of the Torah that doesn't apply to the non-Jews, but applies to the Jewish people, is something that it's essential that the Jews be focused on that and can't become confused and dissipated from their focus on that. Because the reality is that even though we say on a practical level that of the 613 commandments, some apply to the non-Jews and some apply only to the Jews. All the commandments apply to the Jews, but some of them only apply to Jews, and the rest apply to the non-Jews. So we might say, oh, well, that's not for the non-Jew. You might say that's not relevant to him. No, it's not. It's not that it's not relevant to him. It's absolutely relevant to him. The fact is that even though there's a commandment, the commandment to build a temple, the commandment to write a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, these type of commandments are a responsibility of the Jewish people, yet they're relevant to the entire world. Because if the Jew goes off track and he fails to see his responsibility to build the temple and to steward the temple and to have the temple service and to have the different responsibilities of stewarding the Holy Land and the food that's set aside for the priests and the food that's set aside for the temple and so forth, all these different things. If the Jewish person fails to see that and honor that, then the whole world is falling into darkness, because the whole world is dependent on this tiny fractional small group of people charged with this responsibility to carry out the responsibility. So if you were to say, listen, we've got a fantastic guidebook over here, divine guidebook for humanity, the 7 commandments and the 30 commandments and all the commandments that apply to the non-Jews. So let's say that the Jewish people are just going to do those commandments. That sounds on one level. It's going to be even, everyone's going to be civilized and conduct themselves properly and know that there's a God. No, but the whole world as a whole is going to miss out tremendously, because it's not just about creating a civilized world. We have to bring in that world the holiness. We have to bring into the revelation of godliness in a way that is charged to the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's what we have to inculcate in every single human being, that understanding. Now, the Jewish people are charged with understanding the importance of what they're supposed to do. But also a non-Jew needs to understand the importance of that and be able to say, oh, I see what the Jew is doing is so essential for the benefit of every single human being, this mission to bring this awareness of God Almighty to every single human being, that they're going to realize that you want to have, if you would understand what a Jew is able to accomplish in this world, then every non-Jew watching this would go next door right now, find a Jew and say, why aren't you keeping Shabbos? Do you realize when you're not keeping Shabbos, you're affecting the whole world. You're bringing the whole world down. Think about it for a second. What's Shabbos? Shabbos is the recognition, the testimony that God Almighty created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Now that is the fundamental foundation of all belief in God Almighty. When you say we're not talking about here a God Almighty that's some sort of distant thing, then the world kind of is an afterthought. No, the world is an intentional creation of God Almighty. And that means you are an intentional creation of God Almighty. I'm an intentional creation of God Almighty. So how do I, as a Jew, testify to that? Not only to myself, but to my family, to the community, to the entire world, is by ceasing from all labor activity on Shabbos day. So now, if you're a non-Jew and you're going to say to yourself, listen, you don't have an obligation to cease all 39 types of forbidden labor on Shabbos. So what does it matter to you whether the Jew stops? No, it's absolutely essential to you that the Jew stops, because the Jew stopping is a testimony to all of humanity. It's a declaration to all humanity that the world was created in 6 days and God Almighty rested on the seventh. So you need the Jew to stop on Shabbos. If you were to understand how important it is that to wake up the entire world, to provide this testimony to the entire world, you would go and you would stand in the driveway of your Jewish neighbor, prevent him from taking his car out on Shabbos. You'd be like, what? I'm not letting you take your car out on Shabbos. What are you doing? You're bringing the whole world into that darkness. When you get in your car and you light a fire, which is one of the forbidden 39 labors on Shabbos, when you light that fire, you're bringing darkness to the entire world. You are denying God Almighty. You're denying that He created the world in 6 days, the rest of the seventh. I can't tolerate that you are going to bring this darkness into the world. I can't have you driving on Shabbos. So what would you do? You'd go and you'd block his car in a loving way, of course. You'd say, here, sorry, no driving on Shabbos. Maybe you'll say to him, what, you need some help or something? I have an extra, you need what are you going to go to the store for first though on Shabbos? Shabbos, you should sit with your family, you should be praying. Why do you need to go to the store? You're missing a salt for your table. I have salt in my cabinet. Whatever it is, you would see to it that this person would reorient his thinking back on track. If you see that a Jew is not putting on tefillin, the phylacteries, which have the box on the head and the box on the arm, that has the declaration, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one," and they're positioned in the boxes, that the 4 portions of the Torah that relate to the, we had 2 of them. We just read now in the Torah portion yesterday, Parshas Boy, Parsha of Tefillin. It's put in order. The order they're put in is that the person who's facing the person wearing the tefillin should see, even though they're covered inside the boxes, but they should see the Torah. They should be positioned so that the person will read it from right to left, would see them in order, because the wearing of the tefillin is meant to have an impact on the entire world. The whole world is going to see that there's a human being that's wearing on his forehead the Torah portions that relate to the oneness of God Almighty, that God Almighty took the Jewish people out of Egypt, which is a redemption for the entire world. That's meant to be a declaration. The whole world's supposed to see that and to be in awe of this reality. And when a person is in awe, they're going to conduct themselves properly. So if you see a Jew who gets up in the morning and doesn't put on tefillin, oy vey, the world that person is not contributing to the amount of promotion and excited declaration of the oneness of God Almighty into the entire world. So that is a negative effect on you. You as a non-Jew need to say, Jew, why aren't you putting on tefillin this morning? What do you mean? What do you mean you don't? Let me find that. I'll get a rabbi here to help you do it, and I want you to do it every day. You don't have a pair? So here's a phone number. Call this rabbi who's a scribe who transcribes the Torah portions from every generation for thousands of years by hand from another handwritten copy. Get yourself a pair of tefillin. Why? Because you need it. You need him to. We need. The world needs this tiny group of people to not lose sight of the truth and to continue to broadcast the truth. So it's very nice that there's one rabbi giving this video right now, but we need every single Jew to do this. Every single Jew needs to be waking up, and what he wants to do is get the message out to the world that there's nothing besides God Almighty, that God Almighty lovingly creates every person. So you want to make sure that every Jew is doing his job. The world is dependent on it. It's as essential as making sure that every human being is doing his job, because you can't have two people killing each other. That's removing the divine image from the world. God forbid. Similarly, if a Jew is distracted and he's not doing his special responsibilities, that's a disaster for the entire world. So when two people are going to come together and they're going to be so confused about what their responsibilities are and their special responsibilities in the world, and they're going to marry together, it means to say that they both lost track of what this special responsibility is. The person's become so clouded that he can't see that he has to make sure he brings more Jewish kids into the world to raise them to be soldiers in the army of God Almighty. Mitzvos Hashem, which is the God Almighty talks about that. Talks in the prophets about the hosts of the Lord, meaning to say, on one level, that's talking about the angels, but also it's talking about the Jewish people are like this tiny army of people that are completely committed to bringing the knowledge of God Almighty to the entire world for the benefit of every single human being. So you don't want that to happen. So as a non-Jew, you would say to a Jewish person, you'd say, what are you doing? What are you doing over here? What are you doing spending your time looking for a mate among people that are devoted to a mission of civilizing the world, of doing the Sheva mitzvahs, b'nei Noach, doing the 30 mitzvahs, and all those incredibly important mitzvahs? You're supposed to be finding your soulmate is a Jewish person. So if you were, it's interesting. And there was a Rabbi Eisenbach in Montreal. He just passed away. Very, very special person. He was originally from Jerusalem, the holy city of Jerusalem. And he lived in Montreal. And many, many years ago, he and a friend of his, they went into a non-kosher restaurant. I think it was on Shabbos, but I don't know that, but it was definitely a non-kosher restaurant. And they went into the middle of the restaurant, and they knew that a lot of Jews ate there. And they called out in front of the entire restaurant, this restaurant is not kosher, and a Jewish person should not be eating non-kosher food here. And it's forbidden to eat this food, for a Jew to eat this food. And they left. I don't know if they were escorted out or they just left by themselves. Now, the end result was that this had an impact on the people who were there, because one of the families that was there, they went home and they were like, it's really shook them up. They ended off coming to learn Torah. They were not religious at all. They came to learn Torah. They became completely Torah observant Jews, and they were Jewish family. They became Torah observant Jews, and then all their children were raised as Torah observant Jews, and they have many, many children and grandchildren, great grandchildren today who are Torah observant Jews and rabbis and Chabad shluchim and so forth, as a result of going in and setting the record straight. So it doesn't have to be only a rabbi who does that. A non-Jew could be in the restaurant and see a Jewish person and say, what are you doing in this restaurant? This restaurant is not for you. This is non-kosher food. Because when that Jew is eating, we all want to be polite. Want to be polite and, oh, well, don't want to say anything to offend anybody, but the fact is we see that Rabbi Eisenbach and his friend, they put aside all politeness to drive the message home. And we know about one family. I heard this from his wife, this story. We know about his this one story of people who were affected, but everyone who was there was affected. So we have to have that clarity. So that's just what we need to understand. Now, we have to understand how to apply. What do we need to do? We learned last week that the things we have to do to keep that clarity. And we should not get into drinking parties that are going to lead to intermarriage. We should not be doing things where, let's say, that the Jew is eating the non-Jew's food in his house, because that's going to, even though it's completely kosher, that's going to lead to either directly intermarriage or that they're marrying their children to each other. That is a calamity of lack of clarity. The world needs every single human being to be on track and every single human being to be completely alert to his mission, his responsibility. Now, so I received a question over here in an email. I said one time we were having a pizza in one of our learnings, and I said everyone should come for the pizza. So one of the people who's a regular learning with us, wonderful participant in these classes and videos. So he writes to me, I'm not planning to go to New Jersey anyways, but I wanted to mention that your invitation to dinner didn't specify, so I thought I would ask something. My local rabbi says that Noachites and Jews should not feast together because it could lead, God forbid, to intermarriage. Now, I did later ask him if this could be just fine if it is the men only having a barbecue together, and he said that would be fine. So, to review what we learned last week, the concept of feasting together, you cannot go to the feast and the drinking as an established thing held by the non-Jew. But we learned last week, if the Jew is in the non-Jew's house and the non-Jew says, "Oh, have a," let's say L'chaim, have a beer. It's something that's spontaneous, and it's not a fixed, regular, scheduled event. Then the Jew could drink the beer there. Also, there's the Jew could have the non-Jew come over to his house. So it's about staying focused. So in this case, this person who wrote this email is definitely welcome to my house to come for a meal, and he could say L'chaim also. And we have to recognize this is not meant to create a division between the Jews and the non-Jews, but rather it's intended to maintain clarity of responsibility that is going to keep everyone on track and not lead, God forbid, to something that's going to take that generation, the next generation, and the following generations completely off track into confusion, where they're not able to see clearly what their responsibility is. So I'm going to continue now in learning about things where there's concerns about interactions between Jews and non-Jews. And we said that there's two types of these things. One is that we have a concern of the non-Jew is a fantastic person. It's not a concern that he's a fantastic person. It's marvelous that he's a fantastic person. He's so fantastic, as a matter of fact, that you love spending time with him, and he loves spending, or if you're not Jewish, you love spending time with the Jewish person, and you're very friendly with him, and the closeness could lead to a blurring of distinctions in terms of the responsibilities and end off to some sort of intermarriage, God forbid. So that's what we learned last time in the 19th paragraph. But we said there was a second type of issue, which is that some people among the non-Jewish people are simply, unfortunately, tragically, not aware of the fact that they're creating God Almighty's image, and they don't conduct themselves accordingly. And they tend, or they could actually be, murderers, bandits, and so forth. And so there's explicit warnings to be careful. You see, when you're naturally good-natured, and you see that every single human being is created in God Almighty's image, and you want to reach every single human being. A Jew doesn't have a problem with anybody. He doesn't have a problem with anybody. He sees everybody as created in God Almighty's image. He's ready to talk to everybody. He's ready to embrace everyone by recognizing and helping them recognize they're created in God Almighty's image. He's ready to help bring that person to a higher level of awareness of his own existence, of God Almighty's existence, of his purpose in the life, of the goodness in life, of the abundance in life, of God Almighty's love for him and for every single human being, and that the God Almighty wants him to bring more children into the world. So a Jew is ready to speak to everybody. And as a result of the Jew is ready to speak to everybody, the Torah comes to let us know, just be aware that some people are not exactly reciprocating that good sense, that good attitude, that positivity. And therefore, you have to take precautions. And what are those precautions? Here in chapter 20. And the sages forbade another number of things that you have to be careful about for the following reasons. A Jew, Yisrael, remember we said Yisrael means a warrior of God, and the Yud refers to the constant state of being a warrior of God. He should not seclude himself with a idol worshiper. Shehem chashudim al shvichus damim. They are suspected of spilling blood. They're suspected of being murderous. And even is damen the Yisrael akum b'derech teifloi l'tzidei. If the Jew is going to come upon a idol worshiper on the way, meaning to say while traveling, taflu l'tzidei, he should move to the side. He should avoid interaction. Tafel literally means something that's secondary to. So let him move away from that idol worshiper. If they're going up on a path upwards and similar things, the Jew should make sure that he goes up first ahead of the non-Jew. Because the concern is that if a person has murderous intent, when you have the height advantage, when you're on a higher elevation, you have a significant physical advantage over the person who's lower than you, and therefore that can be used for nefarious purposes, for actually turning around or kicking and striking down the person who's in the lower level. So the Jew has to make sure he's going up first. But even though he's up first, to make sure that the non-Jew is not behind them, literally, like right behind him. Because still he could pull him down. But rather move away to the side a little bit. If they're going down, on the other hand, the Jew should make sure that the non-Jew goes down first and the Jew's coming down second. He should never bow down, put himself in a vulnerable position in front of this non-Jewish person to take anything, ever. Afilu b'mishur, even on flat ground. Shelo yerutz gogoloiso. So he should not strike and destroy his skull. The non-Jew wouldn't strike and destroy his skull. Because one way to kill a person, and we see this actually is brought in Tanakh, in the books of the Torah, that Yoav, who was the King David's chief general, he did some things which were inappropriate in using his military prowess and killing certain people that was not appropriate. And one of the ways he did that is he asked, and I can't remember, there was two people that I specifically mentioned, but in order to get the person in a vulnerable position, he asked the person, he came presenting himself as if he was asking a legitimate Torah question, and it was about how a person who has is not fulfilling his responsibility to marry his late brother's childless widow, he has to remove the shoe and so forth, and he asked him to show him how that's done. And when he bent himself down to take off his shoe to show an example of how this is done, that's when this general killed him. And so we see that bending down in front of another person puts a person in the hands of the other person, completely vulnerable, and his head is now right in front of the person. He has no defenses. He's now not able to see what's happening, and he is there's no defense that he could possibly do. So it's an extremely vulnerable position to be in. So the Jew cannot bow down to pick anything up, bend over to pick anything up whatsoever, ever. So he should not be struck in the skull. If the non-Jew asks him, where are you going? If the Jew had to travel one parsa, which is a measure of distance, he had to go one of those measures of distance, he should say to the non-Jew that he has to travel two. Always tell longer than the actual distance you're planning to go. Now, why is that? Imagine that you're on a train together, a carriage together, and the person has a bad plan. Okay, so there's you want to go 5 stops, and the person asks you where are you going? You tell him I'm going to the destination that's 5 stops away. If that person has bad plans, he's going to plan accordingly to strike early enough to rob or kill before the 5th stop. If you tell him that you're staying on there for the 10th stop, then he thinks he has more time, and he can't there's a bigger chance that he's going to plan it later on. Usually it's person plans and figures out and waits to the best possible opportunity, which is going to be after the 5th stop. Now, what's going to happen at the 5th stop? So the 5th stop is you're just going to get up and you're going to get off. Now, without any warning to the person who has these bad plans. So the other thing is that, let's say the person is not going to kill him on the train, but he sees, okay, this guy, he's going to get off the train with him, and he's going to follow him and kill him, and maybe there's other people on the train. But he says, oh, he's getting off at the 5th stop. He's going to get off and he's going to walk down. Where's he going? He tells him exactly where he's going. Okay, there's a dark alley over there. There's a vulnerable spot over there. That's where he's going to plan the attack. So he's got all kinds of plans in mind that relate to the 5th stop. But if he says, the Jew tells me he's getting off at the 10th stop, he's thinking about what's going to happen at the 10th stop. He's going to get off of him at the 10th stop. All of a sudden comes the train, stops at the 5th stop. The Jew stands up, walks off the train. The guy doesn't have time to organize himself. He didn't plan this out. He's not settled in it. He didn't get his stuff together. Boom. That's too late for him to change his plans. So always say a longer distance to create that confusion and to prevent some sort of attack and ambush. Okay, then it continues over here. I'm sorry, I skipped the line. A non-Jewish midwife should not deliver for a Jewish woman in a private situation, even if she is an expert. Okay, so this is telling us that the situation is suspected to be so dangerous that even though the mother needs an expert midwife, but the fact the Jewish mother needs an expert midwife because the non-Jewish midwife is suspected that she'll kill the Jewish baby that's born in a private setting, therefore she should not allow this person to be a midwife in a private situation. And she also should not nurse. The non-Jewish lady should not nurse the Jewish baby if there's no one else there, if it's a private situation. We're concerned that the baby will be killed, God forbid. Now, this was all talking about in the Jew's home, in a private Jewish setting, but she should not give birth, and she should not nurse, have her baby nurse in the house of the non-Jew, even if there's others that are standing there right in the room at the time. But if it's in a Jewish home and there's others there, al gaba means to say that they're like really, like al gaba means on their back, meaning to say they're really present. They're not like in another part of the house, not paying attention to what's going on, but they're really there. Then it's permissible for the non-Jewish midwife to help the Jewish woman give birth, and the non-Jewish midwife could also nurse the baby. And also, if people are going in and out there in the Jew's house, that's permissible. Meaning to say, we said, ideally they'll be standing, the other people will be standing in the room, and if not, at least they're going in and out, so there's a constant state of awareness that there's other people around and the person's not going to do something, God forbid, inappropriate. A Jewish person who's injured or sick, that has a dangerous situation, their life is in danger, they're not allowed to receive medical services from a medical person, non-Jewish medical person, unless that person is an expert, a publicly known expert. The chazaka shalom mara emnusay, because it's presumed that this well-known, famous non-Jewish doctor with a good reputation is not going to do something that's going to damage his reputation. And also, the Jew should not go to be healed by the non-Jewish doctor unless there is found there many people. And the reason is for all these is that the suspected is a person who's not connected to God Almighty is suspected of being murderous, and we can understand that because we see that when a person does not have the awareness of God Almighty and a God Almighty that loves every human being in the forefront of his mind, then he will get sidetracked by other plans, by other motivations, and actually conduct murderous behavior. And that could be on a small scale, and it could be on a large scale. So we see here the urgency is to teach every single human being how to be a righteous human being. But in the meantime, in the last moments of this experience, where there's some people that don't know about God Almighty, then we have an obligation to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in a vulnerable position, in a vulnerable situation, that person who has another agenda, whether it is a personal agenda or he just wants to kill somebody, or an ideological agenda that's murderous, we have to make sure that we don't put ourselves in a vulnerable position that gives them the opportunity to strike. And that is because we have an obligation to preserve our lives, to be able to continue to spread God's message in the world. And it's also interesting, you could take note over here that this applies that even though the mother needs someone to help her as a midwife, she's not allowed to, in the situation we described that are forbidden, she's not allowed to take this help. And the person who's injured and ill can't take help from someone who's suspected of being murderous, even though he's in danger, because there's a danger from going to that person for assistance. So it leads us to a fascinating other practical explanations and realities, which we don't have the time to get into right now, but have to be very conscious that in today's day and age, when you have people that are actual atheists, that not only they're not just mistaken, have a mistaken conception of who God is, but they're actual atheists that are trained in having no value whatsoever in human life, and actually consider it to be dispensable, and are in the category of presumed murderers, and they will murder a person who, as a patient who is ill or terminally ill or doesn't have family members around and so forth, and they'll do it either openly or in all kinds of surreptitious ways. The person has to realize that the practical result of this, both for a Jew and a non-Jew, is not to seek medical help from these people, except in particular situations where they are both experts and their reputation is online. If they don't have any liability and they can't suffer consequences for their improper actions, then that is not considered having the reputation online. So we have to realize, we have to take these halachas that we're learning now, these laws that we're learning now, should be learned. It's very interesting. Rabbi Steif is putting this in a compendium of all the laws that apply to the non-Jews, and for a non-Jew to learn this, because a non-Jew should also take heed from the lessons over here to everything that we learn now about in this today's learning, but last time's learning. This learning is also, it applies for a non-Jew also, to recognize he has to be very careful who he's making himself vulnerable to, and make sure that the person he's making himself vulnerable to is putting himself, seeking medical advice or birthing help or nursing help and so forth, has to make sure that a person that is actually a believer in God Almighty, and also if they're not a believer in God Almighty, but at least it's in the right circumstances, they're being treated in public where there's other people around, it's an expert who has liability and runs a risk of suffering the consequences if he's to do something bad. God forbid, he can't just hide it in the medical records, can't just hide it in the big dark halls of these institutions. And so this is a lesson for every single human being.